Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with a video just to discuss Kislev and all the things Kislev might be bringing to the table come Warhammer 3. Of course, recently we've got a unit reveal, and with that came quite a bit of a ability and magic and character reveal, of course, with the teaser, with the gameplay teaser for Warhammer 3 involving Kislev against Khorne. And we probably got to look at a good, in my opinion, quarter to third of Kislev's entire roster, which I think is pretty nifty. It gives us, I think, a baseline to work with of what we can expect from the faction when it does finally hit the battlefield. Of course, though, it is important to keep in mind that all this is also subject to change. Warhammer 3 is still a ways away. There's months to go, and in that time many of these abilities and units will probably change. I actually hope some of them change. I definitely think there's some stuff here that's just not very good and some stuff that is just insanely good, so I'd hope those things are revised come Warhammer 3, but regardless, I think this list here does give us a good idea of what we can expect Kislev's strengths and weaknesses to be, and where we can really expect them to shine, and what we might see being a problem for them. There's also certain aspects of Kislev that were already anticipated that are kind of being vindicated here. The focus on ice, the focus on sort of solid leadership, the focus on some hard-hitting, fairly light units, but also some unexpected implementations, like, for example, the heavy armor on some of their elites, which I think not many people really expected to be the case, or really nobody did. So some interesting toss-ups here, certainly some stuff to discuss, and without further ado, let's dive into Kislev with a discussion of the abilities and spells. So first and foremost, their unique lore of magic, or one of two, because we're going to be getting a second lore, and that is lore of Tempest. That was one that was not projected, as that was not a lore for Kislev on Tabletop. And I know Kislev wasn't a faction in recent editions of Tabletop, but in the various supplements and prior Kislev prior Kislev lore, Tempest wasn't necessarily a lore they had, so we'll see what exactly that pans out to be. But Ice was definitely a sort of a trademark lore for them, one of the big hypes for the faction, and going over it here, it definitely should be bringing quite a lot to the table. First and foremost, the passive is a very defensive and rather solid buff, in my opinion. 15 armor and 12 missile block chance is rather good. It's got 11 seconds duration, and it's important to keep in mind that Lore of Ice has 3 fairly cheap spells that you can just spam. You've got the Ice Maiden's Kiss, Frostblades, and Ice Sheet. Ice Sheet absolutely dirt cheap and spammable, which you can just drop around the clock to keep your army roided up with 15 armor and 12 missile block chance, which is pretty good. That's a really hefty bonus to be operating with, especially because you can keep it up almost all the time. It's much like Lore of Nehekara's passive synergizes excellently with the spells. It might not look that great on paper, but then when you put it in practice, it's so good. It's similar here in this case, I think, with Lore of Ice, where you've got 3 spells that are very cheap, so you should be able to maintain this extra armor and extra missile block quite effectively. Going over the rest of the actual lore here, we've got Ice Sheet as the baseline cheap spell, and this is one that immediately causes concern for me, and I think this is probably the most concerning spell in this list. Minus 48% speed is not something new. We've seen this with Gorkul Fix-It. The difference is Gorkul Fix-It is quite a bit more expensive spell off the top of my head. I believe it's like 4 or 5 Winds of Magic. I might have longer duration, but it's definitely not as spammable. It's not a Malice you can maintain as Greenskins 24/7, and it's already a rather good spell. Paying only 2 Winds of Magic for it, synergizing with Frost Shield, with only 18-second cooldown, and you still get 17-second duration, is pretty bonkers. It gives you a lot of control, and it's not like you don't have other spells in this lore that give you some control too. You also have Heart of Winter potentially, so you could bounce them back and forth to just maintain constant debuffs. And there's, of course, units with Ice, Frostbite, and that sort of thing in the roster as well. So there's a lot of control, and that was to be expected with an Ice-themed faction. But I think this spell, at least at surface vet level, might be a little too cheap. And means that if you get stuck in melee with Kislev, you are not leaving. Could definitely be a problem if you're stuck in a cavalry fight, for example, and need to extricate yourself. You just won't be able to. 40% speed debuff is really tough. This isn't net of a Mintox, so and Kislev doesn't have the missile pressure of, say, Empire, so I don't think you have to worry about getting snared with this and then gunned down, because you can still move out of range. 48% speed is tangible, but not that terrible. It's not a Rune of Wrath and Ruin. It's not a Net of a Mintok. It's not keeping you snared in place, essentially. But it does mean that Kislev's going to be able to control enemies trying to get into their backline, which is, I think, significant. The faction, I think, is going to have some issues simply because of how much they're paying for some hybrid units. Those units will obviously be more expensive, and thus you'll have less width. But it also means you're going to have a hard time extricating yourself. And so this is probably the most concerning spell on the list here. But I think a pretty cool spell, and obviously makes sense for the Lore of Ice. Moving on to Ice Maiden's Kiss. At surface level, this does appear to be a pretty similar spell to, say, Wind Blast. Unfortunately, here we don't get the ranges for all of these abilities, but I would assume this is a very similar spell to Wind Blast. Similar cost here. And should do an okay amount of damage, perhaps more akin to Bray Scream or something. I'm not sure if Overcast will do AP damage. Most likely, this will be sort of decent against lightly armored targets, something you use to beat up on Bretonnian peasant bows or whatever. And looks like a pretty potent ability, though not sort of insanely so. And oftentimes, with, for example, Wind Blast, you double hit models. So this 12 damage per second might seem pretty low, but as you pass through, you might find you're doing a decent chunk of damage, especially to lightly armored targets. So I assume, just based on the cost, this won't be an AP spell. Frostblades is next, and that's basically a sneaky stabbing. I do believe it might be almost literally a sneaky stabbing. I think the only difference, sneaky stabbing only buffs AP, while Frostblades also buffs non-AP. So it gives it some more value with, keep in mind the Greenskin roster with sneaky stabbing has a lot of AP units. You've got Black Orcs, you've got, of course, all your Boar Cav, which benefits greatly from that, whereas the Kislevite roster has a lot of non-AP, so getting an extra 25% non-AP is nice for a unit like, say, Griffin Legion or Winged Lancers. Of course, thrown on a unit like Bears, this is a pretty insane buff. And it does synergize very nicely with Frost Shield, being still a fairly cheap spell. Nothing too impressive here. I just think it's a decent spell and comparable to others we already have in the game. Death Frost, the other middling spell here. 1.8k damage over 27 seconds. I do believe this was compared to a budget Fate of Buna. I don't believe it's like a Spirit Leech or that sort of thing, but definitely looks pretty solid. Should be something that can apply some decent pressure to target, but keep in mind 12 minutes of magic cost is a somewhat hefty price. It's not going to have much synergy with Frost Shield here. And it's also not a crippling amount of damage. Knocking off a third of a heavy cavalry's HP pool it might have some value against, say, Kislev or Bretonnia, but against a lot of factions, paying 12 wins of magic for that isn't necessarily the strongest. It also takes a long time to do that damage. It doesn't just melt the HP off really quickly. So I could see this being a sort of iffy spell. I don't necessarily think it's too potent. I think it seems reasonably balanced, at least at surface level. Moving on, we got the two top tier spells. One of them is Crystal Sanctuary. This freezes a friendly unit in place, but gives it 66% damage resistance. Now, at the moment, I don't think it's super strong based on what we've seen from Kislev's roster so far. Because blocking a unit in place on short range missile units is actually kind of a problem, because then they can't pivot to fire, which actually limits their ability to fight back. A lot of times you want your missile units to be able to pivot to engage new targets. So if you can't do that because you drop the damage resist on them, it's not that great. Also, locking melee units in place where your opponent can flex and just leave the fight and move around them, not necessarily that strong. However, if you're engaged in an artillery duel, I could see this being a pretty insane ability. And this is something we haven't seen yet, really. We've only seen Little Grom, but it's fairly likely Kislev's going to have cannons. They had these in tabletop. They do have like a lightweight Empire-style artillery roster. Just don't have the cutting-edge artillery Empire has. At least they didn't on tabletop. But throw 66% damage resist on a cannon, and if it's comparable to an Empire cannon, you're going to win every artillery duel in the game, or dang close to it. Something like a bolt thrower or Empire cannon will stand no chance. The only thing that might stand a chance is like dwarves, because they can drop if they brought like the Rune of Grungni and they've got a Master Rune of Master of Warding at the moment, then they can stack their missile resist to comparable levels. But for most factions, they're not going to be able to shoot through this. Certainly not quickly. So this could actually make Kislev an incredibly powerful artillery faction, which is kind of concerning to me. I don't think Kislev should be, that shouldn't be a defining trait for the faction. Shouldn't be dominance in the artillery duel. Would be more interesting, I think, to see this Crystal Sanctuary have an AoE effect of but lower damage resistance. Make it more akin to, say, the Empire battle prayers, and the shield of faith, and make it slow your units down. I think that would be a more reasonable effect, because right now, while it has some clear downsides that are not going to synergize well with, say, a missile heavy or offensive melee style focus we're seeing from the current Kislevite roster, stacked on top of Little Grom, perhaps engaging in artillery duels, or stacked on top of Kislevite cannons in artillery duels. This could be a very match breaking or shootout breaking spell, and it's something that I find personally, at least, a little concerning, and I'd like to see the spell be a little less min-maxed. But that's just my thoughts there on Crystal Sanctuary. Moving on to Heart of Winter. This is obviously the top tier nuke spell for the lore. Winding up spell. So it starts at a fairly measly 24 damage a second and minus 15% speed, but over the course of 32 seconds, which in game terms is actually a pretty long time, it ramps up and does an increasing amount of damage. So I do believe this means it's 3 damage a second, then you get 5 damage a second, 8 damage a second, and then 11 damage a second. So you get this pretty steady increase in just how much damage it does, and it controls the unit super well. So if you need to snipe something and want to deny it the ability to flee, this will be a pretty potent way to do so. You can lock a unit of Demigryphs or something along those lines in place and just melt them. Or perhaps it's not. Actually, now looking at it, I guess it's probably going to be 24 damage per second. I can't imagine you only doing, what is this, like 200 damage total. Now that I think about it, that would be kind of goofy. So probably going to be looking at some insane damage out of this. And the ability to control units. So you've got a Fate of Buna and Snare all in one. Need to catch a target and kill it. This could be the way to go. Combo with bears and crush someone. But I think for the cost, it shouldn't be too insane. At least at the moment, it doesn't look too insane. It does actually have an effect range and require, so you can potentially just leave the area in the AoE of this, which in 8 seconds is a decent amount of time to get out of dodge in this initial phase. So much like Final Transmutation, for example, can just devastate a blob and delete it. I think this is going to be similar. If you stay blobbed up, you're going to pay the price, but if you break apart, which you can do, 15% slow isn't too significant, and 8 second is a pretty long time, so you should be able to break apart and leave the only affected target as a single unit, at which point 24 Winds of Magic is a high price to pay. Moving on to items, the two we saw were Frostfang and Crystal Cloak. Frostfang looked to be pretty decent. It's an explosion ability, shoots spikes of ice up. It seemed to be a very solid damaging ability for Katarina. And you can see here it does actually give you your AP damage as well as the non-AP, so some pretty powerful stuff there. Yeah, should be able to do quite a bit to enemy armored infantry, honestly any infantry, and enemy cavalry in particular. I would assume this will do quite a bit. Crystal Cloak, on the other hand, it doesn't seem to be very good for a legendary. This seems to be like Dark Mail 2.0, aka, or I should say original Dark Mail 2.0, because this is kind of weak. I thought 10-in-1's ability that gives ward save when he casts is trash, but this says the ability is only enabled if casting. So if this only happens while you're channeling magic, this is pretty terrible. It means Katarina gets 22% physical resist for like 5 seconds tops if she's channeling like Heart of Winter. Because there's no way this happens where you cast and then you get an infinite duration of this spell. So what it probably is this gives you 22% physical resist while you're casting. That's just abysmal. I think it should be more, perhaps an 11% ward save after, or physical resist after you've casted, something like that. at least more comparable to 10-in-1's Plaque of Sotek, and even that's not a very good item, but like at least it should be something more comparable to that. The abilities for the Priest, though, are a bit stronger. We've got Celiac's Lullaby here, and Ursun's Roar. So for Celiac's Lullaby, in particular, this one's actually a little bit concerning, because it's a 15% heal. It looks like we're getting percent heals now, which is kind of cool. It means a high HP unit is going to get a really beefy heal, though granted spread out over 15 seconds. And low HP units will get less healing, so it's not going to synergize as well there. You're not going to be able to heal cap a character as easily. That said, as far as I can see, there's no limit on this ability. And for example, we see uses are limited to 2 on Frostfang. So you will just be able to infinitely heal, and 90-second cooldown is pretty darn short. It's for such an ability. Obviously, fights could be over much faster than that, but if you're able to get 2-3 of these and you're fighting in a blob of, say, bears, that's a pretty meaty heal that you're getting. Personally, I'd like to see this ability maybe drop in cooldown, but get a hard cap at, say, 2 uses. It's not like we see the Star of Avalorn get infinite uses. We don't see, and that's a Lord level spell. We don't see, to be fair, it's difficult to compare, but we don't see even Thrott's Remoldering doesn't have infinite healing. The only infinite heals are very slow regen auras, which tend to take a while to kick in. I guess CM might be hoping that this is comparable to that. It's just that you get in a burst, but then like effectively over time it takes a while for it to get value. But in my opinion, it's a little concerning that it has no hard cap. We'll definitely see how that pans out in actual gameplay, in like actual multiplayer gameplay. But at the moment, not too thrilled with that. Kind of like Soulfire at the moment, I think is a bit overtuned just because it has no hard cap. I could see Celiac's Lullaby being similar. Going on to Ursun's Roar, though, I think that is a much less useful ability. First of all, leadership for Kislev is kind of meh. Kislev already has insane leadership, and we're going to see that as we scroll over to the next page here. But yeah, they already have good leadership. And charge bonus is nice. But look at how this works. This is like a Silver Horn. You need to nail the cast time pretty exactly. You've only got 9-second window to use this ability. That's pretty terrible. Nobody uses the Silver Horn. First of all, almost nobody uses the Thane. But even if you did use the Thane, nobody uses the Silver Horn because timing that charge bonus buff is very difficult. It's very difficult to, because you've got such a short opening, especially with infantry. But even with cavalry, it's going to be difficult to nail this cooldown really well. The reason Orion's Horn of the Wild Hunt works in comparison is because it has a fairly long duration. So you've got a pretty good opening to use your charge bonus buff. But with this, you got 9 seconds. And if in between microing, jumping from your priest to your cav, odds are you're not going to get perfect value out of this. And I do kind of wish it worked a little bit differently. Maybe it was just an auto activate when you're close to an enemy unit. Or have a longer duration. Just give it like a 20-second duration. Make it a green item and give it like a 20 or 30-second duration. The leadership buff will last a bit longer, which is nice. And more importantly, you'll have a bigger opening to use the charge bonus. Because right now, this is the primary reason to use this, is the charge bonus. And you do not have an opening to really use it. Moving on from the abilities to the unit roster. First and foremost, I should mention what the ability is for Kislev. Kislev's passive is a plus 16 leadership when a unit drops below 50% health. I think this could be a really nasty mechanic for a lot of factions to deal with because, well, it means your trash, like the Kossars, is going to hold much better. These guys have 60 leadership baseline here. You can see, unfortunately, this was taken directly from game. So, unfortunately, a lot of these stats are adjusted, and I'll try to nail which ones are adjusted due to debuffs in battle and that sort of thing. But, unfortunately, some of these units are debuffed here, or buffed. But 60 leadership spiking to 76. That's over high elf spear level. That's higher than dwarf level. That means that unit is going. And if you look at, for example, Marauders, like Norscan Marauders are one of the best chaff in the game because as Rage winds up, they get an extra 8 leadership, and that usually hits around the 50% HP mark. So imagine Kossars who are going to drop below 50% and they get a spike for 35 seconds of 16 leadership. It essentially means that in a lot of situations, these units are just not going to break. You'll have to wipe them almost to a man, because by the time the ability wears off, the unit's almost dead anyway. So it's going to last for that unit's lifetime, essentially. Really helps this HP have a bit more extra mileage. And put that on their more elite units, Winged Lancers, for example, who I do believe sit in the 70s for leadership, kind of mocking the poor. I do believe these guys sit at 70 leadership, kind of mocking some of the other cav in the game that just do not have very good leadership. Or especially the Zargaard here, who I do believe sits at 75 leadership. You throw it on Griffin Legion or Elemental Bears. Or actually, no, sorry, not Elemental Bears, Bear Riders. And you're looking at units that have crazy good leadership for at least a stretch of time. And I think it's important to keep in mind you're going to have some functionally unbreakable units with that ability. And there's not much you can do to stop it. So I'm a little concerned. I think it might be a little too strong. Perhaps something that's a little longer, something that's a little more consistent, but not so overwhelming in a burst would be nice. But we'll see. We'll see. Going over the infantry. First and foremost, we got the Kossars. These guys are your missile infantry. They're obviously, these models are adjusted for ultra, so on normal settings they're gonna have the same missile model count as normal archers, 68 models. So their missile stat line is comparable to archers as well. So high elf archers, or Bretonnian peasant bows. Unfortunately, we don't have costs for these units, though we did see the supply costs, and people are speculating those are equivalent to their multiplayer costs. I do believe both the spears sat at 500 and these guys sat at 450. So, assuming those are the gold costs, these units are kind of okay priced. Their combat stats are nothing to write home about, but they are okay. So if you need to do some cleanup last second, they might do okay. Kossars here should be able to defend themselves against very light cav, at least for a period of time, especially when you factor in that they've got that leadership buff. They're not going to just rout when a unit of Glade Riders or whatever gets in your back line. They'll actually quite possibly drag those units into the muck. So pretty strong there, but terrible armor and subpar range for a bow unit means they're going to be quite easily pressured by enemy missiles. If you're, for example, Empire, and you can just bog down the enemy front line with state troops and then shoot them with crossbows or huntsmen, they're going to melt Kossars very easily, because 15 armor is just not worth very much. You're definitely going to want to use that ice passive, for example, to drop that armor up to 30 at least, and get that 12% block chance to mitigate missile damage a bit. But yeah, decent. I think it's all in all decent unit. Should be able to defend themselves a little bit. Perhaps pressure enemy backlines a little bit if needed. If you feel like if you get an opening to rush enemy melee the way you get with, for example, Chameleon Skinks, you can rush it and just try to win in fisticuffs, because against a lot of units you will do so. You'll win against low-end Dark Elf, High Elf, Empire, Bretonnian, etc. missile units pretty handily, but definitely going to be vulnerable to enemy missile pressure in turn. Vulnerable to units like mortars. Definitely going to be an issue there. But regardless, pretty cool unit there. No chaff infantry that we saw, but it's, I think, easy to assume that there's going to be a melee Kossar variant that's going to come with 90 models and have probably comparable stats to Empire State troops with lower armor, but of course that faction passive. How those units perform, it's definitely going to be up in there, but I think that could make or break just how useful these Kossars are. If you're stuck paying for a more expensive front line than Empire because of that faction passive, plus a more expensive bow line because of the dual nature, you could find yourself in a tough spot where you're just paying too much for an army that can't cover all its bases. Kind of like what High Elves suffer with at the moment, just not able to quite generate enough width. Moving on to some of the more expensive infantry here, skipping over the cav and characters for a second. We got Zargaard and Ice Guard. So the Zargaard are, by all appearances, going to be a 750 to 800 gold unit. They do have 90 armor, not 75, and a silver shield. So pretty solid tankiness, 50 melee defense, which is almost Marauder champion levels. And of course, they do get that faction passive. Pretty terrible damage output. Their weapon strength and melee attack is... Actually, the melee attack's a little lower than Chaos Warriors, and their weapon strength is on par there. So they are not going to be killing anything quick. Keep in mind, this is only a 60 model unit, so fairly low model count, and yeah, they're not going to be killing units fast. Chaos Warriors will kill faster. Most units in this price range are going to kill faster. And keep in mind, killiness is a defense of itself in and of itself. So while this unit may be decent at holding with 50 melee defense, it won't be able to kill chaff particularly quick with just 60 models and fairly poor weapon strength. It's not going to be winning those fights fast. And if you're struggling for width, just due to the faction passive for Kislev and due to the dual-wielding nature of their missiles, trying to cram in a mid-tier infantry might be a bit of a problem, in my opinion. But still, the stat line seems definitely solid for a 750 or 800 gold unit. Definitely these guys could perform pretty well. Decent speed for an armored unit. Good leadership at 75. And all right stats for most part. Ice Guard with glaives here, so that means there's presumably another Ice Guard variant. Not sure entirely with what, but perhaps just sword and bow. But they do come in as a elite missile unit. Based on the numbers we saw for supplies, I believe the supply cost for these was 1250. I sincerely hope this unit does not cost 1250 in gold in multiplayer, because it would, in my opinion, not be worth it. That's 60 models. It's pretty terrible armor, but decent combat stats. You do get a charge defense against large. You do get immunity psychology and the faction passive. So these ladies will be borderline unbreakable. Good speed, so able to kite against slower infantry for sure. Passable combat stats. You get frostbite on both melee and range, and magic in both melee and range. So if you're fighting against cavalry, you should definitely be able to drag them down into the muck. Physically resistant cav like Grail Knights or Hex Wraiths or whatever, beware. You are going to get murderized here by these very angry glaives. Fairly low weapon strength at 28, but we can assume there's probably about a 10 to 20 bonus versus large mixed in there, so they'll be hitting pretty hard against large. And yeah, just a decent combat stats, but the missile stats is where I feel this unit falls off. You do get frostbite, which is nice for control, but you only get 160 range, unlike say Sisters of Avalorn, so you're not going to be pressuring enemy missiles super well. You're not going to be able to outrange enemy missiles by a wide margin, and you don't get AP missiles. So this unit is very much a utility unit that can defend itself. You're paying a lot of money, presumably, for utility. I think in practice this unit is not worth more than 1,000 or 1,100 gold. Frostbite definitely has great synergy with Sheet of Ice and all that stuff, but for a non-AP missile unit, the only other unit I can think of that's comparable to that is the Shadow Walkers for Elithanar, and those guys are not particularly good either. They're basically a unit that pays an arm and a leg for utility and survivability in melee, and not many people use them. Not many people go and want to play Nagaryth. So I fear that the Ice Guard with glaives could be in a similar boat where they give utility, but that utility is just not worth it. They definitely should be rather good in melee. Moving on to cavalry, and sorry, I should also mention the Streltsy. I actually missed mentioning them here entirely. But the Streltsy are one final unit we've saw in this reveal here. Middling armor, decent combat stats, but nothing too amazing. They got a combo gun and axe, and they basically have handgun missile stats. So I think this is going to be a reasonable unit, probably a unit that clocks in at about 800 gold, because I doubt they're going to get the dwarf discount, and their combat stats are just solid across the board. Definitely going to limit Kislev as far as their ability to field a strong gun line here, or missile line, because every one of their missile units is probably going to be overpriced because of their melee stats. But it does give Kislev some ranged AP pressure, does give them some cheaper-ish flexible AP. A big challenge for High Elves, for example, is that they don't have any cheap AP. And while this isn't cheap AP, it is still probably going to be 700 to 800 gold unit, so you're not struggling too much. And if your opponent gets some middling heavy cav into your backline, like for example Empire Knights or Silver Helms or Winged Lancers, these guys are probably going to take them to Pound Town, because okay combat stats, okay armor, and 34 weapon strength means they're not going to mess around. And if you manage to preserve these guys well throughout a game, and then need to take a few decently armored infantry to Pound Town, these guys are basically budget shade great weapons. So they should be able to beat the crap out of a crippled unit like Chaos Warriors. And 30 speed, they can actually kite against slower infantry too. So they're not a terrible unit here. I think just a very solid unit here. But as mentioned, for infantry, we haven't seen any of the cheap, what I assume, melee Kossars. Because I can't see Kislev going in with absolutely no chaff infantry. I feel like that is necessary for any faction. Every faction needs some baseline holding unit. And we also didn't see Kreml Guard, who are one of the iconic elites. They might be made into like Zargaard with halberds or whatever, but Kreml Guard in the lore was a elite unit of halberds that should be one of the few well-armored units and one of the better disciplined holding units, kind of like the melee equivalent, I assume, to the Ice Guard. The Zargaard being something CA made up for this game. Moving on to cavalry now, we do have the horse archers as the cheapest unit here, presumably meant to be the Ungol horse archers. They get obviously the usual things you'd expect from a cav unit. By all appearances, they look to be somewhere between the Illyrian Reavers and or perhaps Glade Riders, really, and Mounted Yeoman Archers. Better leadership than, or solid leadership, respectable melee stats for a skirmish cav. Certainly not top tier the way Illyrian Reavers are, or the way the Chaos Marauder Horsemasters are, but a respectable melee unit for what they are. Pretty poor, I would say, missile stats, because you're probably looking at more cost than Mounted Yeomen, but comparable missile strength. 140 range is nice, means you're going to have good poke, especially against short range factions, but only 18 ammo, so I think it's easy to assume that this unit is not going to be super effective at dishing out lots of damage over time. It's not going to be... It's going to be like Illyrian Reavers. You definitely will want to use this unit in melee a bit and take advantage of those decent melee stats to get the most value out of it. But it can also counteract enemy skirmishers if you're not able to, or don't feel the confidence in your ability to protect your foot missiles. So I think all in all, looks like to be a nice unit. The big question is going to be where it falls price-wise. I would see it as a 600 or so gold unit, but because I don't think it should be as expensive as Illyrian Reaver Archers, but or Glade Riders, but also definitely needs to be more expensive than Mounted Yeomen. Moving on to the cheapest cavalry, we got the Winged Lancers, and these bad boys are, well, interesting. They're kind of like a budget Wild Rider. They get 80 armor, that's been debuffed here, bronze shields, but you get 84 speed, which is really good for a cav. That's shock cav. Like, you don't actually see that on many. That's literally Wild Rider tier. So there's no other fast cav or shock cav in that speed range. Terrible sustained combat stats, even worse than Empire Knights. Weapon strength on par with Empire Knights. I believe it was glossed over in World of the Games that this is 31 and 9 split. But great charge bonus, so definitely a unit that hits hard on the charge. Has okay survivability, but nothing too impressive. And definitely not a unit you want to leave in a fight. Probably a unit that's going to sit somewhere around the 900 gold mark if I were to guess, because they do get the fear trait, which means that leadership is going to go a lot further. Functionally speaking, that 70 leadership turns into 78, and then you get that faction passive, so very difficult to route, I think, for a cheapish heavy cav, but simultaneously definitely not that heavily armored and not that hard to kill. And once they've once they've blown their shot with their charge bonus, if you get them stuck in combat, they are probably going to be screwed. Which moves us on to the Griffin Legion, where these guys are kind of like Silverhelm or either Wild Rider Light or akin to Silverhelms. Griffin Legion is basically Knights of the Blazing Sun side rated. You get a little more or a little less offensive power, much better leadership, slightly more mobility. You get fear, and you get that Kislev trait. I assume it's going to be a 1250 gold or so unit, so nothing too insane, but 1250, maybe 1300 gold unit, just because those traits are really strong. But you don't get that magic resist Knights of the Blazing Sun get. You don't get that those fire attacks. So those are downsides. But all in all, looks like a solid unit. One thing I was kind of surprised by here is that their offensive stats are kind of low. I expected this melee attack to be at 40 easy, and then maybe the weapon strength a little higher. But the armor's kind of high. 100 is more than I expected. I thought Kislev would cap out at 80 or 90, and I assumed 90 would be like the Kreml Guard. So with them hitting 100, I think is not something I'm a fan of. I don't feel it fits Kislev's theme. Kislev, I think, should be more about punchiness and stalwartness, but light armor, because armor is Empire's gimmick. Because as far as human factions go, because they're the faction that has access to dwarf smithing, and dwarves give them Grom Rail plate. So they get Great Swords, Reichsguard, Demigriff Knights, all have insane quality armor. But that's not really a Kislev trait. So I feel like this armor could be dropped to, say, 90 or 80 again. They could be more like Winged Lancers there. And then just hit a lot harder. Give them 45 weapon strength. Hopefully a good AP ratio. Maybe like 80 charge bonus. Or like 40 melee attack. Like Knights of the Blazing Sun. And 45 weapon strength. Something like that. Something to define them as a more punchy unit rather than a somewhat holding unit. Which they kind of are here. 30 melee defense is higher than Knights of Blazing Sun. They're almost like a lightweight Reichsguard. I don't know. I'm not like a weird mix between Reichsguard and Knights of the Blazing Sun, and I'm not personally a huge fan of that. I really do feel that their low armor should be one of the more defining traits of Kislev. Which brings us to the last Big Bear unit here, or the big Cav unit here, the Big Bears. Warbear Riders, not necessarily, they're more like a Monsters Cav. Dragon Ogres are probably the closest comparison. 110 armor. A little over 6,000 HP, which is quite a lot less than Dragon Ogres, but you get AP damage, band bonus versus large, high melee attack, lowish melee defense, terrible charge bonus, good speed, 75, which is pretty nuts, solid leadership there, and of course fear and the faction trait. So this is a unit, and probably the unit that most caught me off guard with its statting. 110 armor seems way too high for Kislev especially, but it just seemed the unit. When I looked at this unit, my assumption was Warbears are going to be a 60 to 80 armor unit with insane HP that's slow and hits like a truck in sustained melee. Instead, what we're getting here is a unit that doesn't hit that much like a truck. This is the same weapon strength as Dragon Ogres, which isn't terrible, but pretty normal. Okay sustained stats, though definitely more on the melee attack side of things, not very much melee defense, which makes him vulnerable. But insane speed, 75. That's in the ballpark of horned ones, demi Griffinites, all those units. I just don't think that really makes sense for bears. And armor at 110 is just bonkers. In my opinion, this unit should have much more HP. Should have HP at least on par with Dragon Ogres, and then 60 to 80 armor. So it's more lightweight. You got to screen for them, but yeah, definitely I'd imagine this unit more akin really to Dragon Ogres, but probably punchier. And this just feels like a very weird way to do them. I don't really like the way Warbears ended up here, stat-wise. But as far as unit balance goes, I think they should be solid. Definitely have their place. They're basically a Dragon Ogre unit. So, and speeds and cost is probably going to be similar. You lose out on HP and missile resist. Instead you get armor. But pretty similar, I would say. And then we do move on to the heroic and single entities here. Little Grom, another weird unit. Not sure I'm a huge fan of the design. Kind of goofy, being a sled with like an ice sheet under it. I feel that's going a bit much. It's like something you'd get out of High Elves, but which it just seems weird for a human faction. But very tanky, towed by bears. Not too mobile at 35 speed, so I don't think it should be too difficult to deal with. But 450 range is definitely meaty. Hits pretty hard, kind of like a mobile hell cannon. I think the range might need to be toned down a little bit, just so you can't kite and bully enemy cav or artillery too easily. And 105 armor is pretty nuts. But you do only have 3,000 HP, so definitely going to be a bit flimsy. Not even though it might look really strong, you only get 28 melee defense. It's a single model, so this 110 weapon strength is not that significant. And it's kind of like a lightweight steam tank almost, but with much less mobility and much less HP. So I could see this unit being fairly vulnerable in melee, and depending on cost, could be balanced. I'm just not sure I'm a fan of the high range. 450 is a bit much. Steam tank, for example, if we look at other mobile artillery pieces, most of them do not match. Most of them don't match or outrange artillery that's static. Steam tank does not outrange cannons. It doesn't even outrange high health bolt throwers. And that's like one of the longest range ones. Bone Giant does not outrange cannons. And same thing extends to Necrofexes and all those units. So not sure I'm a huge fan here of how Little Grom has been implemented. But still a cool unit. And going to be fun to mulch some infantry with Little Grom. Elemental Bear, another unit I'm not the hugest fan of. Big old centerpiece unit for Kislev. Lots of armor, lots of HP though. Keep in mind this will be about 7,500 on normal settings. Unbreakable. Has a Frosty Breath, has Frostbite, so even though these stats might not look very good, it might not look very mobile, it will be able to keep you trapped in combat. Imagine this comboed with Ice Sheet, you're in trouble. And it does get physical resist, so really beefy boy. Able to dish out a lot of hurt until it's literally its last breath due to the unbreakable status. Terror causing. I'm just not a fan of a large single entity for Kislev. It feels very out of place. In general, for human factions, the big old centerpiece monsters seem odd. Like I don't mind the fact that Empire, for example, didn't get the Imperial Dragon, just because it feels a bit odd for a human faction. And I feel like the big old Elemental Bear, that's a knockoff. That's a knockoff Rogue Idol, for example, just doesn't feel right for Kislev. But as far as the unit goes, I think it seems fairly reasonably balanced. Stats don't seem too crazy. Frostbite's going to be rough for some factions if they try to kite, but otherwise, or hit and run with their own SCMs, but otherwise doesn't seem too bad. Then we've got the then moving up towards the Serena, we've got Vitilis Shlachta. I don't know how they intend this to be pronounced. It's budget Slavic mishmash language, but either way, he's the patriarch. He's the character whose abilities we saw, the Roar Urson and the Lullaby there. So fairly low HP when you look at it here. This was mounted on a bear, so 75 speed, pretty mobile. I do believe this armor is not debuffed, so he actually only has 75 armor, so not too crazy. Leadership, good. Decent charge bonus, high weapon strength. Definitely hits hard, but not that tanky. This is going to be about 3,300 HP pool, so with only 75 armor, definitely a squishier character for what's probably going to be pretty expensive. But it does give you some leadership buffs, does give you some pretty insane AoEs, and he's got his heals. He's got that 15% heal, which is rather strong. But all in all, doesn't look crazy. Yeah, Faith has all the armor any man needs. Well, I don't know, 75 armor. I don't think will hold up too well against a lot of targets. Moving on to Serena Catarin, sitting at 6 armor, and I don't know how this ended up at 6. I feel like this was probably 21 armor, but regardless, not super beefy as we can see here. Insane leadership. Surprisingly good melee stats, which I'm not, and I get that these are buffed up at the moment here. I'm not entirely sure by what. I assume it's probably like a +5/+5, or something along those lines, and like maybe +40 weapon strength. But still seems that she has a fairly high combat stats, which is weird. I don't think Serena Catarin was ever supposed to be a hybrid caster. She's kind of like Teclis or Balthazar Gelt, or Gorst. A very powerful caster. I don't know if Gorst is a powerful caster, to be fair, but a very powerful. He's kind of even in the lore, he's kind of meh. He's whatever. But Serena Catarin should be a very powerful caster. And here we're not really seeing any Winds of Magic generation, which is weird. At the same time, she's got decent combat stats, even on foot, and keep in mind she's probably gonna have mount options. So just very strange. I'm not sure I'm a fan of this design here of her combat stats, but of course she gets cool Lore of Magic. She gets some neat spells and neat itemization. Hopefully, some of which will change because that non-existent physical resist buff doesn't seem very good. But all in all, definitely a cool character. She does get frostbite and melee, which is neat. I'm just not a huge fan of her having decent combat stats. It feels odd because. And there's kind of been a trend with CA giving mage casters either crazy mounts to make them powerful in melee, or giving them decent combat stats like what you get with Alariel. Alariel had okay combat stats on tabletop, but the stats she got in this game was really, really high. So there's been a trend of that with CA, and I'm not a huge fan of it. I really don't feel that mage casters should be, like, you should be able to have some dedicated mages that are just a dedicated mage. And I don't see why Serena Catarin should be a decent combatant, but all in all, still very cool. Overall, for the roster, definitely some things caught me by surprise. The high armor on the Griffin Legion, and especially the Warbear Riders, is something I'm not a huge fan of. I feel Kislev armor should be lower, and their punchiness and HP should be higher. That would fit their theme more, I think. As mentioned, not a huge fan of the character being, I feel Catarin being a little too good in melee. And a little concerned with Grom. The Elemental Bear, yeah, not a fan of that unit design as a whole. But I don't think it's OP. Infantry, though, and the generic Cav, really, really cool stuff. I'm pretty excited. I hope the Ice Guard are not overpriced. I'd be really concerned. For example, the Elemental Bear right now, what we saw is 2,200 gold supply for it. So if that's its cost, I could see these stats being fair. Little Grom sat at 1,400, I believe. So that seems reasonable for what it is here. Maybe a little underpriced, but reasonable. But Ice Guard, it better not be 1,250. At that point, I feel this unit is something nobody's ever going to take, because paying 1,250 for pure utility, which is really what they are. They're pure utility that can do okay in melee, is insane. But some cool infantry units, some really cool cavalry units, and overall fun roster by the look of it. Same thing with the magic abilities here. Crystal Cloak seems a bit weak. Crystal Sanctuary seems a bit too min-maxed. And Ursum's Roar just seems unreliable. But then we've got some really powerful looking spells like Ice Sheet or Heart of Winter potentially. So bit of a back and forth there, and that's to be expected with a new faction coming out. But I am pretty excited to see you, Kislev, coming to the field here, and definitely hoping some of these things get revised in these coming months. But overall, I feel like the theme is there, and the faction is coming together nicely. And we're getting a faction that's going to be mobile, that's going to stick around to the bitter end, that's going to hit hard, and be really able to outmaneuver its opposition due to all the crowd control it has, but simultaneously be a little bit limited by its unit costs, because you're going to be paying extra for all of these hybrid units, and definitely going to be you're definitely going to be limited, I think, in just how big of an army you can get compared to, say, Empire, where every unit is a specialist, and you've got either your melee specialist, your range specialist, that sort of thing. So in comparison to that, I think Kislev is going to be struggling a little bit with costs if units are fairly priced. So I think that will be a unique limitation. But definitely should be able to stick around rather well and be able to control the battlefield, and it'll enable their cavalry to do some insane work, and potentially be an insane artillery dual civilization, as Crystal Sanctuary here might really enable that, and that's one thing I'm a bit concerned about. But either way, it looks fun. That's my thoughts there on Kislev, and my interpretation of what we're seeing here. Feel free to let me know what you guys think down below. I'd love to hear your guys' comments, thoughts, and opinions. I'll do my best to respond as soon as I can. Do thank you all for watching, and we'll see you all in the next one. Bye for now.